Hi everyone, Joseph Koenskin here. Welcome back to my art studio. Today I'm going to be painting a kingfisher perched on the branches of this painting that I've got behind me on the easel here. I love the color of these birds, their unique shape with that long beak and the feathers that stand up on the top of the head. I think this is going to be a great bird to add to this scene, so let's get started. I'll start with blocking everything in, just some of the mid-range values that are going to be on this kingfisher. So it'll be mostly like a navy blue, which is ultramarine blue, with some alizarin crimson, gray, and a little bit of raw umber. And just down onto the bird's body, they sort of have this triangular shaped blue part that comes down onto the belly, and then onto the wing. And here I just want to establish some color just so I can get some shape and start building up some of those values. All the feather details will come a bit later. And I really like the shape of this bird. It's got, this really sort of stocky head and this very long beak, which they use for catching fish when they dive into the water. So I'm not going to get too precise here just yet. I just want to establish where everything is with just a little bit of color. And then down onto their little feet. Down onto the lower part of the belly, which is going to be white, but it's mostly in shadow, so we'll establish that a bit later. And I've chosen a female kingfisher because they have this rusty orange, or what some bird books will call like a chestnut colored band that goes across the belly. And I think this orange band, this little pop of orange, will be really great and be a nice contrast for the entire painting. And then I'm just going to erase the pencil lines that I had from drawing the bird onto the painting. And then once that's done, I can get started on some of the details. So now I can start refining the feathers that are on the crown of the kingfisher's head. And I'm just going to take some of that background color and just sharpen up some of these edges here, just so that I can get a little bit more structure and figure out where each one of these feathers is going to be standing up. And then I'm going to alternate sort of back and forth between a little bit lighter and a little bit darker, just so that I can blend some of those colors together and kind of soften some of those edges. And then with that same color, I'm going to go in and just start establishing the feather structure that's on the kingfisher's face. And I'm being very careful and deliberate here about where I put everything, because this is really going to make the head look real when it comes to adding in finer details later. Then I can start going back and softening some of these edges. I really want these feathers that are sticking up on the top of the head to be very light and very wispy. So I'm going to try and have a very light edge on each one of them, with what's going to be a darker, more shadow color right in the middle. So just lightening those top edges, making them as soft as possible. And you can see I go back and forth quite a bit between light and shadow and a mid-range value, just to try and soften each one of those colors so that each feather kind of blends into the next. And then I can start with a shadow. I'm starting with quite a dark shadow here so that I kind of know how dark I want everything to be, and I think this is going to be almost the darkest that I go here. And then what I can do with some of these shadows is then add lighter and lighter colors later on as I start to develop the detail. And then here adding that darkest color just to some of those feathers. Each feather kind of has a little bit of a gradient that I'm trying to follow, but because this kingfisher is quite small in the painting, It's just a matter of doing it really slowly and not getting too carried away with how dark I make everything. So now going in with a slightly lighter color, just building up on those dark shadows and trying to soften each one of those edges. And I'm just going to use that same color just to fill in the beak because I noticed that it was roughly the same color, so I'm just going to put some of that color down now. Then I can go in and just add a little bit of highlight, a slightly lighter highlight to try and emphasize some of those other feathers. And then with a little bit of a lighter highlight going over top of the brightest parts. I don't want to get too carried away with this. And then they have this white spot that's just kind of right in front of the eye. Okay, then I can get started on the beak. And the beak kind of has a gradient that goes from dark at the tip of the beak to a bit lighter at the base. And so instead of mixing a lot of colors in between, I'm going to try and do a little bit of dry brushing to sort of make this effect look realistic. And then I'm just going to kind of slightly soften that top edge. And then I can go back and just really refine some of these other feathers with a mid-range value and a few more highlights. Okay, now for the eye, I'm just taking Payne's gray, pure Payne's gray, so it's very, very dark, just to make that little pupil. And I noticed I could add it a little bit more in some of these areas with the shadows. Just want to get that pupil nice and round. And then with the highlight, I just want to very lightly dry brush this highlight in. Not too strong. And then I just want to soften that bottom edge with a damp brush and just dab away a little bit so it's not such a hard line. And then for the highlight, I think that really makes it come to life, as the highlight in the eye usually does. So now onto these white feathers that are just on the neck, and I'm going to do the same thing where I try and establish that feather structure. What's going to give this bird that three-dimensionality is going to be following the contours of the bird's three-dimensional shape with the direction that the feathers go. And so they kind of break and they have these little highlights and these little shadows that kind of follow this pattern as the bird in this case is slightly turning its head. So again, I'm being very deliberate and very careful about where I put these feather breaks just because I want it to follow that form and that shape. And then I can take my white and start adding some of those highlights. Just being careful to not overly highlight it, but just in the right spots on the lower part of the neck where it's starting to get a lot more light. Okay, so onto the body of the bird, and on this part where you have this little blue part at the top of the breast that goes down into the body, I want these feathers to look very rounded, like it's going from light to very dark throughout this little blue part. And so there's going to be a pretty strong gradient and a strong gradient within each feather. And I want it to almost look like there's a little bit of a break between each one of these feathers. So what I'm trying to do here is just build that structure again with a slightly lighter value and following the contour of the bird's shape. And I can soften some of those edges where it goes from white to this navy blue. And while I've got some of that color mixed, I'm just going to add a few of the feather details on the wing. I'll come back later and detail that mostly, but while I've got this similar color mixed, I'll just add some of these feather lines on the wing. Alright, now I can start adding this darker shadow that's between each one of these feathers. This I want to look like there's a little bit of a feather break between each one so that it really looks like a strong, rounded shape. I'm not going to get too dark just yet. I kind of want to build this slowly to see where it goes and what it looks like. At this point, I'm more concerned with the three-dimensional shape of the bird, making the shadows and the highlights look like it has this nice rounded shape, than necessarily all the details. I can start really detailing things in once I have that three-dimensional shape. A strong sense of light and shadow to give it that three-dimensional shape is really going to help with the realism of this bird. So now I can go in and start just adding these tiny little highlights on each one of these feathers, but just the ones at the top. And then I can slowly bring that down, slowly making each feather a little bit lighter as I go. Just kind of trying a little bit, stepping back to see if it looks right, adding a little bit more, bringing out that shape and that direction of light. I think here I just wanted to add a little bit of a darker shadow just to really emphasize that shape and that light and shadow. And I think that really helped. And just in a couple of these spots where there's a little bit of shadow between some of these feathers, you can see I'm doing this very, very softly. And then I can continue on into some of these white sections that are on the body. Now that I've done the blue part just above this, I can get an idea of how dark I should make the white parts and even this orange part that's coming up on the body. And what I want to do with these white parts of the belly is that I want to start with this mid-range value and slowly build my shadows darker and darker. I find it can be too easy to get carried away with too dark shadows on the white feathers. I want the white feathers to still look white, but just in shadow. So I find the best result that I get is adding darker and darker shadows until it gets to a point that looks correct, and then coming back with highlights over top. So now with even just a little bit of a darker color, and you can see it's not that much darker. Acrylic always dries a shade darker than when it's wet, and so here when I'm painting it on, you can't even see that it's that much darker while it's being painted on wet, because I'm only adding the tiniest amount of black and raw umber to it just to darken it slightly. And I think that's good for now. I can start adding some highlight to see where my shadows are and potentially if they need to be darker or slightly lighter. As well, following the contour of the bird's body and trying to keep that nice three-dimensional shape. And I'm going to come back and clean up some of those edges where this orange part is afterwards, but I just want to establish some of these feather structures in the white parts of the belly. For this band of rusty orange color, I'm just using Cadmium Red Light, some yellow ochre, raw umber, and then a bit of gray just to take the intensity down a little bit. And this is going to have sort of a similar structure as I follow that contour, but each one of these feathers is also slightly highlighted with a little bit of white on the end. So I am going to be leaving some gaps in between where I'm going to put the highlight color to help emphasize each individual feather. And there are some of these orange feathers that come into the white feathers and kind of overlap with some of them, and some of the white feathers overlap on top of these, so I'm going to try and do that and make it look as natural as possible. And now with a little bit of a highlight color that will also help kind of bring the two edges of the white feathers and the orange feathers together. And I'm just paying attention to each individual feather and just starting that highlighted edge that will be quite a bit lighter when I bring in that final highlight. And as I had tried some of these other feathers that overlap into the white part of the body, I didn't quite like that, so I'm just quickly taking that away. So now I can start bringing in a little bit of a darker shadow. I don't want to get too dark just yet. I'm just sort of trying this out to see if this is going to be dark enough. And then right where the wing is tucked into the side of the body is going to be a very dark shadow. And now I can highlight these edges here just to bring out each individual feather. It's easy to get carried away with these highlights and put them on every single one, but it doesn't necessarily need that. I'm more trying to pay attention to just the parts that are being lit by this overcast, sort of very soft daylight. Okay, now I can grab some pure titanium white and start highlighting this one side of the body where the light is coming in. Just very softly trying to build up some of that structure. But it's only lit just on this one side, so I want to try and keep it just to that one side and not get too carried away. And I did notice that the shadow was a little bit too light, so now I can bring in a slightly darker shadow color just for this center part of the body right near the branch. And this is why I like to start a little bit lighter and build darker, because I find it easier to do and a little bit more natural looking than if I start dark to light. And if it's too dark, it's a little bit harder to lighten up than it would be to darken a certain area with my shadow colors. Okay, and then just slightly darker still just at the bottom part. And I think that's looking pretty good, pretty natural in terms of the direction of light. Okay, and just a few more highlights. Onto the wing. This part isn't going to be quite as detailed because the wing is lying very flat against the body and it's turning away from us, so I really just want to emphasize the direction. I'm just going to outline some of these feathers here, but make sure that the feathers follow that really tight contour as the wing is folding around the body. And then just the brightest highlight, which is a little bit of that blue color and mostly white, just on some of the tips of these feathers. just enough to give a hint of the structure of the wing. Okay, so far I think that's looking really great, and now I can get started on the tail, which is going to have these little sort of white dots or kind of small stripes going up each feather. So I'll start with a dark color, kind of a dark gray with some raw umber, a tiny bit of alizarin crimson, and just fill that in, and then lightly outline some of these feathers just so that I know where they are. And I can add these little white dots, which kind of get progressively smaller and smaller as it goes up the tail feather. And I want to keep a lot of the edges on this bird really soft, because when you have such a light background like this, I don't want it to be too harsh of a line. I want it to feel natural, especially as the very overcast gray light, which kind of comes from all directions, tends to keep edges and highlights soft. So relative to the size of its body, the kingfisher has like these really little feet, which is going to be a challenge in this painting with the bird already being a little bit small. So I've got my round zero brush, which has got a really sharp fine point to help me with all these little details of the feet. Now I'm not going to get super detailed because they're so small, just enough to give the correct shape and a nice little direction of light with some small highlights on each one of the little toes. Now for such small fine details, I like to use either a brand new brush or one that's almost brand new where the point on it is really, really sharp. Just using that same mid-range value for a little bit of shadow. Then I can just add the tiniest little highlight to these toes. And it doesn't take much, just a tiny little line on each one. And then I can add some of the darkest shadow. Just to separate them. And then I'll take a bit of a lighter grayish brown and just add the shadow onto the branch. This helps kind of set the bird into the scene when it's casting a shadow on this branch. And then I noticed that where the feathers kind of overlap from the blue to the white and even from the orange into the white as well, it just needed a little bit more randomness to that edge rather than just a straight line. So I'm just going back and adding just a few feathers that are overlapping onto the other ones, taking some away that I don't really like. Just adding the odd feather that's kind of sticking out over top of the others. And I think doing this really just added a nice bit of realism to the bird. Instead of just some perfectly straight lines, there's a little bit more feather break, a tiny bit more randomness, which helps it look a lot more realistic. Okay, and then with that, I think I'm done this kingfisher. I love the way this turned out. That navy blue color with that rusty orange chestnut color, the soft highlights from the overcast light. It was just the perfect bird to add to this scene. So I thank you for joining me while I painted this kingfisher, and thank you so much for watching.